I'm going to call Catherine Delahunty.
Mr Chair, tēnā koutou te whare te ko tēnei pō. I just really want to take a call because I think it's quite rare for the Greens to abstain on a bill. We don't like abstaining, and I think one of the reasons we're abstaining, particularly with relation to Part 2, was outlined very clearly by the previous speaker, Jacinda Ardern, because it's not fit for purpose. And what we believe is there is a law that needs to happen. There is somebody out there that needs to be monitored, and there are groups of people whose offences are always going to be of concern and should be monitored. But there has to be rigorous, consistent clarity, and this bill is not rigorous, consistent or clear. So that's why we're abstaining, because we believe there is a bill that needs to be done, needs to be created, but this ain't it. And so we would really like to see, instead of Australia calling the shots, we would really like to see a government say to Australia, before you start sending people back through your completely draconian and mad, incoherent system of punitive political lack of judgment, which is what the Australians are doing at the moment in a random way because of their xenophobic approach to all kinds of issues, let's say to them, we will be ready to deal with you, and we don't want these people, many of whom were brought up in Australia and spent their lives in Australia, sent back here till we're ready to cope with it. And in order to be ready to cope with it, we need, through a select committee process, to hear from human rights experts and the judiciary and the police and the citizens who engage with these issues so that we get it right. Because we agree with the Minister that there are people that need this monitoring. We don't disagree with that. But I would like to support my co-leader in her issue around Part 2, around the definition of returning offender, and address my remarks to those parts of Part 2 that talk about this returning offender. And again, we are in the hands of the Australians. They're deciding who we are going to categorise as requiring monitoring. And that does not seem right, because if anyone here has been following the way in which people in detention are treated, the arbitrary nature of the way in which the Australian law is being applied in Section 501, etc., we can't rely on them. We need to be clear ourselves about what we're trying to do. Now, I'm taking call tonight because I want to speak for political dissidents, because in any law that affects people's human rights and affects anybody that's involved with the criminal justice system, somebody needs to get up and say political dissidents can be captured by these kind of laws. So a crime that is deemed to be an offence in overseas and can also be an imprisonable offence in New Zealand and being liable for deportation could be a political crime. So you could have somebody who is found guilty of political crime in Australia that is also on the books in New Zealand, but the way they were convicted and the reason for their conviction under Australian law could be quite different from what we would decide was right. But who makes that determination? So we're leaving that to the police force to decide. And some of us have concerns about that because we know that political dissidents could be sent home and be of concern to the legal authorities in this country simply because they're political dissidents. So we are cautious. We are very cautious about anything that smacks of that kind of broad brush, gathering into the net all kinds of people. So it's not only the issue of people who have committed offences at the lesser end, it's also people who might commit offences that actually, under the light of sanity and reason, such as we might have here, are not requiring this level of monitoring and this level of direction from the courts for the 6 months after they returned, etc. But we wouldn't be able to determine that because we're adopting the Australian decision. So if we go to Part 2, subpart 3, it says that if an offender was in detention immediately before his or her return to New Zealand, then these sections apply to this person, and the court may impose conditions on them. So being in detention is not the test. Getting into detention in Australia doesn't mean you're a serious offender. It means you got caught up in the net and you may or may not be a serious offender. And that's our concern. And that's why we really had to abstain, because urgency has led to some of the most ineffectual and Mr. Chair.
Catherine
Mr. Chair.
Delahunty.
I'll just take a brief call, Mr. Chair, because I'm not a legal expert and this is certainly a complex legal issue. But what I would say is that complex and broad brush approaches to what is actually quite a narrowly defined problem are problematic, and we've seen with urgency in this House before when we do things that are potentially, the House does things that are potentially a breach of the Human Rights Act. It can be a real problem and have to be rectified. And again, if we look at the conditions around taking bodily samples in Section 14, the Criminal Investigations Bodily Samples Act 1995 applies to certain returning offenders. And in fact, a constable can issue a data bank compulsion notice requiring the offender to give a bodily sample. I'm actually myself quite offended by the word offender. I think some people have committed offences where they will probably be tagged all their lives with being a risk to the public. But some people, after they've served their time, don't deserve to be called an offender for the rest of their lives. I think the distinction in the law here around criminals and offenders, I would prefer to see language that makes it clear what we're actually talking about, because people who've done their time, who have not committed serious crimes, how many times are they going to be recriminalised by language like this? So we have real concerns about this kind of language and about Section 14 and would be interested to hear about from human rights organisations about this kind of issue. So Part 2 does raise many issues for us, and we are concerned about the broadness of it, the powers of the police, the contradictions that were raised by the previous speaker about the extended supervision bill not being used, which suggests that we're doing this because there is a panic on created by the draconian Australian legal process, but not because this has been thought through, this has been planned. And I think another Labor Party speaker earlier talked about the powers of the police, which would be stronger than the powers of the courts. We have to, especially after Roastbusters, we have to refuse a romantic view of what can happen when we give powers to the police to make judgments which rightly belong in the courts. And that's an important issue for us, which we would have liked to have explored. I myself would be happy to be proved wrong about this bill, but not through urgency, but through a select committee process that laid out clearly who should be on this register, who is an offender and needs constant monitoring, and who is not. And if we could make that bill clear, and if we could actually create some clarity in that bill, then I think that there'd be wholehearted support. But until that time, we are unable to do that because it's too broad a net. And it also, for those of us who who work with political dissidents in Australia, we are concerned about the direction of Australian politics and law and the impact that's having on people who are likely to be, if not now, in the future, detainees for what is actually their right to dissent. And we will stand for the right to dissent being excluded from this kind of monitoring and this kind of lifelong branding as an offender, because that's what keeps us safe. If we do not make these distinctions, if we make our law broad brush, then we will fail to protect the democratic right of dissent and the democratic right of people to cease to be a criminal offender and to actually be a citizen again who has done their time. And if we want to create a society where everybody stays an offender forever, that's not a society where we actually create healing. There are people that need to be monitored. There are people that don't. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.